Before we begin, this is the story of a woman who was handed her ruin like a verdict. No trial, no defense, just 2 sentences and a burning house. And what she did with the ashes is the reason you are going to want to stay until the very last word. If you are new here, welcome. Hit subscribe right now so you do not miss what comes next. And when you have finished listening, drop a comment telling us where in the world you are watching from. We genuinely want to know how far this story travels. Now, let us begin. There is a kind of silence that follows the destruction of a woman's reputation. It is not the silence of an empty room. It is the silence of a room that was full yesterday, full of callers and cards and the rustle of morning visits, and is full of nothing today. It is the silence of a modiste who was deferential last Tuesday, sending a bill marked urgent this Tuesday. It is the silence of 2 women on the pavement below your window, laughing about something that is your name. Clara Vivienne Ashford. And yes, her full name matters because names are the first thing society takes from you. Did not weep when she heard those women laugh. She stood at the window of her father's townhouse on Berkeley Street, still holding the 2-sentence note that had been delivered by a footman who did not wait for a reply. And she listened to the laughter float up from the street. And she thought, so that is how quickly it travels. 2 sentences, no explanation. The engagement was ended. And somewhere between the writing of those 2 sentences and the walk of those 2 women on the pavement below, her entire future had been handed to London society like a calling card with her ruin printed on it. What happened next is not a story about a woman who was destroyed. It is a story about a woman who was demolished, and about the man who was dangerous enough and damaged enough and ultimately brave enough to stand in the rubble with her and discover that what had been taken from them both was never the thing worth keeping. She was called ruined. He was called a monster. They called themselves, in the end, something London had never quite encountered before. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Chapter 1. Vivienne. The announcement, the letter from the solicitor, arrived at 8:30. Vivienne knew it was from the solicitor before her even crossed the threshold of the study. The study, because Mr. Greer's correspondence always came in a particular shade of cream envelope with a wax seal that left a faint greenish cast, and because her father had been expecting it for 3 weeks, with the particular dread of a man who already knows what it will say, but cannot bear to have it confirmed. She was sitting in the chair nearest the fire, not because she was cold, but because the chair nearest the fire was the one that faced her father's desk directly, which meant she could read his expression as he read the letter without having to ask him to explain it. Her father did not always explain things to Vivienne. He explained things to solicitors, to stewards, to the men he consulted at his club on Tuesday afternoons. He had never quite worked out that his eldest daughter had been quietly managing the reality of his financial situation for 4 years while he managed the appearance of it. He broke the seal. Vivienne watched his face. She had become very good at watching faces. It was one of the skills a woman acquired when the world decided her opinion on things did not constitute valid information. You learned to read the information on other people's faces instead, and you became so precise at it that you could have conducted a diplomatic survey. Her father's face went through 4 distinct changes in the space of reading 2 pages. The first was recognition, the careful neutrality of a man who has steeled himself. The second was something she could only describe as the collapse of a pretense he had been maintaining for so long it had become structural. Like watching a wall that was mostly paint and confidence finally admit it was not a wall at all. The third was a look she associated with late evenings and brandy, which was the look of a man confronting a number. The fourth was the look he got when he thought about Clara. Vivienne said nothing. Outside, the London morning was proceeding with its usual brisk indifference. A coal cart on Berkeley Street, the distant clang of a blacksmith 2 streets over. The sound of the upstairs maid beating a rug against the rear of the house in irregular thumping rhythm. Her father set the letter down. He folded his hands on top of it, which was what he did when he wanted to think without speaking, and then he unfolded them almost immediately, which was what he did when the thinking was too loud. "The situation," he said, "is somewhat more pressing than I had been led to believe." Vivienne kept her expression precisely level. "How pressing, father?" He looked at the fire instead of at her. 18 months, he said. Greer estimates 18 months before the estate must be formally surrendered to the entailment. She absorbed this. She had estimated 22 months based on the accounts she had reviewed without his knowledge. So she had been wrong by 4 months in the wrong direction. She filed this information away with the cold efficiency she had learned to apply to everything that would otherwise make her want to put her fist through the wallpaper. "And the townhouse?" she asked. "Let for the full season, which covers the worst of the immediate debt, but Clara." "Yes," he said it simply, without qualification, because they both understood what it meant. Clara was 17. She had, by the brutal arithmetic of London society, 1 truly prime season remaining before she crossed into the territory of young women who had been available for too long, which society treated with the same distaste it reserved for slightly stale bread. Still technically edible, but not what one ordered fresh. Clara needed a season. A proper season. With a proper presentation. With the right vouchers and the right ballrooms and the right introductions. And all of that required money that was currently being described in a solicitor's letter as not available, which meant everything depended on Vivienne. Which meant everything depended on the engagement to Lord Cedric Harlow, Viscount Ashgate. The door opened. Her father's study door opened without a knock, which only happened when it was Jenny, Vivienne's lady's maid, because Jenny had been with the family since before. Vivienne was born and operated on the principle that formality was a courtesy extended to people you were less fond of. "A note, miss," Jenny said, extending the folded paper with the directness of a woman delivering a message, not an occasion. "Just brought by a footman. He didn't wait." Vivienne stood. She crossed the room. She took the note. She recognized Cedric's handwriting immediately. The precise copperplate that she had once admired, because it looked like the handwriting of a man who cared about precision. She unfolded it. 2 sentences. "Given the circumstances which have recently come to my attention regarding the Ashford estate situation, I find it necessary to withdraw my offer of marriage. I wish Miss Ashford every happiness." That was all. No apology, no specificity about what circumstances. No acknowledgement that they had been engaged for 9 months, that he had sat at this table and eaten Christmas dinner with her family, that he had walked in the park with her 11 times, and kissed her hand with every appearance of genuine warmth. "I wish Miss Ashford every happiness." The coldness of it was almost admirable in its efficiency. She refolded the letter. She turned back to her father, who was still reading the solicitor's letter again, as if a second reading might revise the numbers. She said, very quietly, "I need a moment, father. I will return shortly." She walked upstairs. She went to her bedroom. She sat in the chair by the window that looked out onto Berkeley Street, and she did not weep, because weeping was a luxury available to women who had time for it, and she did not have time. She thought instead. She thought about the land. The Ashford estate's eastern boundary ran adjacent to the Harlow property at Ashgate for approximately 4 miles. She had known in the abstract that the proximity of the two estates was part of the reason the match had been encouraged. What she had not fully calculated was how much of Cedric's interest might have been specifically territorial rather than personal. She thought about the timing. The engagement had been announced publicly. Its ending would also be public. The ending of an engagement was not, in itself, a catastrophic social event. It happened, it was recovered from, women remarried, men found other prospects. But the ending of an engagement required a narrative. It required an explanation that society would accept. She was still thinking about this. Calmly, precisely, the way she approached the tenant farm accounts, when she heard the voices below the window. 2 women. She recognized them by their bonnets first, then by their voices. Mrs. Harriet Fenton and Lady Anne Beauclerc, who walked this street every Thursday morning on their way to a mutual friend's house in Mount Street. She was not thinking about them particularly. She was merely aware of them the way one is aware of peripheral movement. She heard her own name. She did not intend to listen. She stood to step back from the window, and then one phrase stopped her as completely as a hand against her chest. The French attaché, apparently, was seen leaving. Vivienne went still. And Cedric told the Forsyth woman directly. She told everyone at the Pemberton route. The voices passed. The rest of it was lost to distance and the sound of the coal cart. Vivienne stood at the window for a long moment. She had not been with any French attaché. She had never been alone with any French attaché. She had met a French cultural representative at the Dunmore reception in February, been introduced, exchanged perhaps 4 minutes of polite conversation about a painting, and moved on to speak to Lady Dunmore about the garden. That was all. She knew Vu with the cold precision of a woman who understood how these things worked. That it did not matter. The lie did not need to be true. It needed only to be repeated, and from the sound of it, it had already been repeated from Cedric's mouth to the Forsyth woman, to everyone at the Pemberton route, which meant it had been repeated to everyone who mattered in London within the last 48 hours. She stood at the window. The street below was ordinary and indifferent and utterly unchanged. She thought, he did not simply leave me. He lit the house on fire on his way out and told everyone I had done it myself. She did not weep. She went back downstairs to her father's study. She picked up a piece of paper from his desk. She uncapped the ink. She began to write a list. Chapter 2. Vivienne. The ruin. The first formal wound arrived on Friday morning. It came in an envelope from the patronesses of Almac's assembly rooms, written in the clipped, courteous language that the powerful use when they want you to understand. They are doing you a favour by informing you of your own erasure. Her voucher, the small, precious, functionally essential voucher that permitted entry to the most socially significant subscription rooms in London, was rescinded, regrettably, with the kindest regards. Effective immediately. Vivienne read the note once. She wrote it down in the column on the left side of her paper, which she had titled Actions Taken Against. The right column, which she had titled Actions Possible, was currently blank. She was gathering information before she responded to any of it. She had learned this from managing the estate accounts. Never respond to a crisis before you understand all of its dimensions. Reacting to the first number you see is how you end up solving the wrong problem. She understood with precise clarity what the loss of the voucher meant in practical terms. Almac's was not simply a ballroom. It was the front gate to an entire network of aristocratic connection. The marriages made in its rooms, the alliances formed at its tables, the vouchers themselves functioning as visible proof of social credibility. Without one, you were not simply excluded from the dancing, you were marked. On Saturday, no morning callers came. This was not immediately alarming. Saturday was sometimes slow, but the silence of the parlour at 11 o'clock, which on any previous Saturday would have held at least 3 or 4 visitors, was a specific and readable silence. Vivienne sat in it for 20 minutes and wrote in her column, "Morning callers, none." On Saturday afternoon, a footman arrived from the home of Lady Persephone Alcott, the hostess of the musicale that Vivienne had been anticipating for 3 weeks. The footman delivered a note. Lady Alcott regretted that due to an unexpected reduction in the size of her gathering, she was unable to accommodate all of her original invitations. She sent her sincerest apologies and her warmest wishes. It was very graciously written. It was the social equivalent of being asked to leave through the servants' entrance. Vivienne wrote it down. On Sunday, her modiste, Madame Fontaine, who had been making her dresses for 4 years and who had extended credit on 3 occasions without difficulty, sent a bill for the outstanding balance of 2 gowns currently in production, marked in red ink, "Payment requested at your earliest convenience," with the phrase "earliest convenience" underlined once. The gowns were not finished. The bill was not yet due. Vivienne wrote it down and added, "Modiste anticipates non-payment. Word has reached trade." On Monday, her father came home from his club with a particular expression that she recognized as the expression of a man who had been spoken to kindly by people who were in the process of removing their association with him. The club, he said, had raised a query about his membership renewal, a formality. Nothing serious. Nothing serious was club language for, "The men who matter here no longer wish to be associated with you." She wrote it down. By Tuesday, the list had 12 entries. It covered half a page. She read it from top to bottom with the detachment of a general reviewing a battle map, and she felt something harden in her that had been, over the preceding years, gradually softened by the effort of being good, of being agreeable and appropriate, and marriageable and careful. It was not hardness born of bitterness. It was more precise than that. It was the hardness of a woman who had spent years applying her considerable intelligence to the project of being acceptable to a world that was now demonstrating it, had never deserved the effort. On Tuesday evening, she attended dinner. The invitation had come from the Morlands, an older family, quieter than fashionable, who had known her father for 20 years. They had not rescinded it. Either they had not yet heard, or they had decided not to care, and she suspected this was nearer the truth. They were the sort of people who made their own judgments rather than borrowing them from gossip. She dressed carefully. She wore the dark blue silk that Madame Fontaine had finished before the rescinded credit, and she put on her grandmother's pearl earrings, and she walked into the Morland dining room with her chin at precisely the angle that communicated composure without arrogance, and she took her seat. And across the table was Cedric. She had not been told he would be there. She suspected. The Morlands did not know there was a reason to mention it. They were not the sort of people who tracked social hostilities. He looked well. He was wearing a blue coat that complemented his fair colouring, and his cravat was arranged with that casual perfection he had always managed without apparent effort. He was speaking to the woman on his left, old Mrs. Morland herself, the mother of the host, with the particular warmth he deployed in rooms with older women. attentive, respectful, slightly deferential, in a way that made them feel both honoured and protective of him. He had not seen Vivienne yet. She watched him for a moment. She watched the performance of him, the ease of it, the apparent spontaneity, the way he managed to make every person he spoke to feel as though they were the most interesting person in the room. And she felt something clarify, in her the way ink clarifies in water. She understood, with a completeness she had not had access to before, that she had never actually known him. She had known the performance. She had been, like everyone else, an audience. He glanced up from Mrs. Morland. He saw her. Something moved very quickly across his face. Surprise, calculation, and then the recovery, which happened in less than a second and resulted in an expression of soft, dignified sadness that was genuinely beautiful in its construction. He looked like a man whose heart was broken. Two of the matrons at the table turned to follow his gaze, saw Vivienne, looked back at him, and one of them reached out to touch his sleeve with the universal gesture of female sympathy. He has made himself the victim, Vivienne thought, and he did it in less than a second, in front of witnesses. She held his gaze across the table. He gave her the smallest, most private smile. It was the smile of a man showing her his hand because he was certain she could not do anything about it. She looked away. She picked up her soup spoon. She spoke pleasantly to the gentleman on her right about the opera season, and she ate her dinner with complete composure, and she did not drop a single word of acknowledgement in Cedric's direction for the rest of the evening. In the carriage home, she sat in the dark, with her hands folded in her lap. I will not survive this by being good, she thought. She had been good. She had been good for so long it had become habitual, then invisible, then load-bearing, the entire structure of her social existence depending on the continued performance of goodness. And goodness had not protected her. Goodness had made her legible. It had made her predictable. It had made her the kind of woman whose reputation could be taken away cleanly, because she had never done anything so genuinely unexpected that the lie required any effort to be believed. She was done being good. She did not know yet what she would be instead. But she was done with the other thing. She opened her reticule and took out a small pencil and the folded square of paper that was her list. She turned it over to the blank side. She wrote, at the top of the new page, what I actually need. Then she wrote, beneath it, for the first time, the name she had been avoiding. Adrian Blackwell, Duke of Ravenswood. She has lost everything society told her to protect. Her reputation, her vouchers, her callers, her Modeste's credit, her father's standing at his club. All of it gone in 7 days, engineered by a man who smiled warmly at elderly women and made himself the victim in less than a second. And now she has written one name on a blank piece of paper. If you already know, this woman deserves everything that is coming. If Vivienne's cold, precise fury feels like something you have felt before, this is the moment to hit that like button. It costs you nothing, and it helps more people find stories like this one. Subscribe if you are not already here, and drop a comment right now. Just tell us where you are watching from. One word, one city, one country. We read every single one. Now, let us meet the man whose name she just wrote. Chapter 3. Adrian, the Return. The crossing from Calais had been rough enough to drive off the passengers below decks, and Adrian Blackwell had stood at the rail for the entirety of it, not from stoicism, but because the cold spray was the first genuinely honest sensation he had experienced in 3 weeks of treaty negotiations that had required him to lie with a precision and consistency that even he found impressive. The final protocol was signed. The counterintelligence network, embedded within the trade agreement, was operational. 3 foreign governments believed they had achieved their respective priorities. None of them were entirely wrong, which was what made it elegant rather than merely deceptive. He had been good at this for 14 years. He was not certain he was still glad of it. The Dover cliffs were white and impassive in the March morning. He watched them approach with the same expression he brought to most things, not coldness, exactly, but the particular economy of a man who had learned to keep his face as uninformative as possible, because informative faces got people killed. Not metaphorically, literally. He had seen it happen. The carriage to London was waiting at the dock, as Jennings, his secretary, had arranged. Jennings was the sort of man who made sure things were arranged so completely that Adrian never had to ask for anything, which Adrian considered one of his finest qualities, and which most people considered intimidating. The Ravenswood townhouse on Grosvenor Square was open and lit when they arrived at 9:30 in the evening. Mrs. Hartley, his housekeeper, was in the entrance hall. She had run this house for 11 years. She greeted him with a nod that was respectful and contained, and said precisely, "Welcome home, Your Grace. Supper is laid in the small dining room. Your rooms are prepared." She did not say she was glad to see him. She had not said that in some years. He was not certain it would have been accurate, and he appreciated that she did not offer things that were not accurate. "Thank you, Mrs. Hartley," he said. He handed his coat to the footman. He looked at the entrance hall, the cool marble, the dark wood, the portraits of Blackwell ancestors, who stared down with the universal expression of people who had been made to sit still for too long. He thought, as he sometimes did upon returning here, "This house looks like a place I live, rather than a place I belong." He had been having that thought with increasing regularity. Jennings followed him into the small dining room with the stack of correspondence that had accumulated in Adrian's 14-month absence. Jennings kept everything organised by category: estate matters, parliamentary matters, social invitations, correspondence from the War Office, and a small 4th category that he labelled personal with such careful neutrality that it communicated, without stating, that the contents were things Adrian would probably prefer not to deal with. There were 47 social invitations. He handed them back to Jennings without looking through them. "Refuse everything." "For how long, Your Grace?" "Indefinitely." Jennings made a note. He had been making that same note with minor variations for 4 years. Adrian ate his supper. He read the estate correspondence, which was straightforwardly alarming in the way estate matters always were. The Yorkshire property required a new drainage system. The home farm tenants needed investment in equipment, and his land agent had been managing the whole situation with the kind of careful optimism that meant he had been managing expectations rather than problems. He set the estate letters aside and picked up the War Office envelope. It was sealed with a double stamp, which meant it came from someone senior enough to have access to 2 separate sealing authorities, which meant it was not routine. He broke it open, he read it twice. Then he set it down and poured himself a glass of wine and looked at the fireplace for a while. A piece of sensitive wartime intelligence has resurfaced in the wrong hands. That was the phrase. Careful, bureaucratic, designed to sound administrative rather than dangerous. But Adrian knew what the intelligence was. He had known for 11 years what it was, and he had known for 11 years who it implicated, and he had spent 11 years watching that family operate freely in London society, with their impeccable bloodline and their parliamentary seat, and their charming heir with his performance of warm attention in rooms with older women. He thought about 47 men. He refilled his glass. Jennings reappeared at the door. "I beg your pardon, Your Grace. There was one additional item I thought you would wish to review separately." He extended a single sheet. "The mention came in a dispatch from our legal office this morning. I thought it connected to the War Office matter." Adrian took the sheet. He read it. He went very still. The intelligence that had surfaced, the document his contact was worried about, was connected to the Harlow family, specifically to the late Viscount Ashgate, whose son was the current Viscount, Lord Cedric Harlow. Cedric's father had sold British troop movements to a French courier in the winter of 1813. 47 men had died in the resulting ambush. Adrian had been the officer who reached that position 3 hours after the attack. He had identified 12 of the men himself, because their faces were known to him, because you knew the faces of men who had been under your command. He had carried the knowledge of the betrayal for 11 years, without proof. The document that had now surfaced in the wrong hands was the proof. He folded the sheet. He tucked it into his inside pocket. He sat at the table in the small dining room of the house that looked like a place he lived, rather than a place he belonged, and he thought about what to do with a thing he had been waiting 11 years to have. Chapter 4. Vivienne, the proposal she cannot refuse. The Duke of Ravenswood arrived at the Ashford townhouse on a Wednesday morning at 11 o'clock. Her father had been told to expect him at noon for a matter regarding the land boundary between the Ravenswood estate and the Harlow property. Her father's solicitor had communicated the meeting request with the particular deference that solicitors used when the other party was a duke, which was a deference so complete it was slightly undignified. The physician, who called every other Wednesday, arrived at 10:30 and was still with her father at 11. So when the Duke of Ravenswood was shown into the parlour, it was Vivienne who was there to receive him. She stood when he entered. She had known, in the abstract, what he looked like. Society was not subtle about physical description. When it came to people it found alarming. And London society found the Duke of Ravenswood extremely alarming, and had been discussing his physical appearance for 4 years in the particular, fascinated way it discussed things it simultaneously feared and could not stop examining. He was taller than she had expected. That was the first observation. He was very tall, with the particular quality of height that came not simply from physical measurement, but from a quality of presence, a density in a room, a sense that the air around him had adjusted to accommodate him rather than the reverse. He had dark hair and dark eyes, and a face that could have been called handsome if the scar did not redirect you. The scar ran from the outer corner of his left eye to the angle of his jaw, pale against his skin, not ugly exactly, but unmissable in the way that battle marks are unmissable, because they represent a moment of surviving something that should have prevented survival. He wore black, all black, which was not unusual for a gentleman in mourning or in formal dress, but which on him seemed less like a sartorial choice and more like a practical statement about the nature of things. He looked at her. She looked at him. Neither of them spoke for a moment. That would have been awkward between different people, but between them was merely a form of mutual assessment. "Miss Ashford," he said. His voice was, she searched for the word, direct, not deep in the self-conscious manner of men who had been told their voices were impressive. Simply direct, in the way of a person who had spent years in situations where unclear communication had consequences. "Your Grace," she said, "my father is detained by his physician. He will be available shortly. May I offer you tea?" "No," she gestured to the chair across from the settee. He sat. She sat. She arranged her hands in her lap and waited with the patience she had developed for rooms where she was not permitted to be the first to speak. He said, without any preliminary, "I know what has happened to you." The lie Harlow told and why he told it. "I know the state of your father's estate. I know what it means for your sister." He paused. "I am telling you this at the outset so that we can begin from accurate ground rather than social pleasantry." Vivienne considered this for 3 seconds. "That is a remarkably direct way to begin an acquaintance, Your Grace. I am told I am remarkably direct. I find it more efficient than the alternative. What is it you want to discuss that requires this particular efficiency?" He looked at her steadily. "I have a proposal, not a romantic one, a practical arrangement. I need a wife. You need protection and restoration of your family's situation. I believe the terms can be made to benefit both parties." She felt something cold move through her. Not fear, but the specific alertness of a woman who has learned to identify when a room has changed character. "Go on," she said. He told her about the entailment, his grandfather's conditions. The Duke of Ravenswood must be married before his 35th birthday, or a secondary title and its Yorkshire lands transferred to a cousin he described simply as unsuitable, in the tone of a man for whom unsuitable covered a range of qualities he had no desire to enumerate. His birthday was 11 weeks away. "I have," he continued, "investigated 6 potential candidates over the preceding months. You are the most intelligent. You are also, I am informed, practical rather than sentimental, which is a quality I find necessary rather than optional." He said this with no apparent awareness that it might be taken as an insult, which she found oddly credible. He did not seem like a man who insulted people. He seemed like a man who said what he thought and had limited patience for the social convention that thought should be softened before being spoken. "I see," she said. "And what do you offer in exchange for this arrangement?" "Financial support for your father's estate, sponsorship of your sister's debut season, social rehabilitation. My name attached to yours renders the Harlow lie inoperative. The protection of the Ravenswood title." He finished speaking. He waited. Vivienne looked at the fire. She looked at her hands. She looked at the man sitting across from her, this large, still, scar-faced duke who had just laid out the terms of her future with the effect of a man reading a land survey. She said, "What do I actually get?" He stopped. Not a pause, a genuine cessation. Something in his expression shifted by a fraction of a degree, a small recalibration, as though she had said something in a language he had not prepared for. "I have just told you You have told me what you offer," she said. "What I asked was what I actually get. What is the daily reality of this arrangement? What authority do I have? What restrictions? What happens to my ability to think and act and manage the things I am capable of managing? Because what you have described is a title and a solution to a crisis that is largely not of my making. What I am asking is what I keep." He stared at her for a long moment. Outside, the street sounds continued. The coal cart, the cries of the street vendors, the ordinary London morning proceeding without the least interest in the fact that something was being decided in this parlour. "No one," the Duke of Ravenswood said slowly, "has ever asked me that before." "Then I suspect," Vivienne said, "that you have not previously negotiated with someone who understood what they were being asked to sign away." Another silence. And then, with what she could only describe as the expression of a man who had just been presented with a problem he had not anticipated and found it, despite himself, genuinely interesting, he said, "I believe we should wait for your father." But I also believe you should be present for the entirety of this conversation. That was how it began. Chapter 5. Vivienne, the negotiation. The agreement took 4 hours, 2 pots of tea, and one occasion on which her father had to be gently redirected from accepting terms that were considerably less favourable than what Vivienne had already prepared to demand. She had spent the preceding night, after the moorland dinner, doing what she did with every problem that required precision rather than emotion. She had gathered information. She had gone to her father's library and found the parliamentary record of the Ravenswood entailment, which was in the public register and therefore accessible to anyone who thought to look. She had found the terms. She had read them twice. She had then spent an hour working through the mathematical implications of various possible arrangements before settling on what she actually needed versus what she was willing to accept versus what she would refuse. Adrian Blackwell sat across from her at the large parlour table, which had been cleared of its usual arrangement of decorative objects and now held nothing but paper, ink, and the 2 cups of tea that were being allowed to cool because neither of them was interested in tea. Her father sat at the end of the table. He was there because propriety required him to be. He was not, Vivienne had gently communicated, required to negotiate. She began with Clara's debut season. Full sponsorship from the Ravenswood estate, she said. Not an allowance to be applied to the season. Full management of the costs, including the presentation gown, the subscription to the right assemblies, and the introduction to the appropriate patronesses. Clara's season is not an afterthought. It is a condition. Adrian made a note. Agreed. She had expected an argument. The absence of one made her look at him more carefully. He appeared to mean it. She moved to her father. Ashford Park is my father's home. Regardless of the legal state of the estate's debt, he retains the right of residency for his lifetime. That is not negotiable for me, and I want it documented. Agreed. A personal allowance, not dependent on your approval for individual expenditures. A fixed quarterly sum deposited to an account in my name only. He named a figure. She countered with a higher one. He met her halfway without negotiation. She accepted. She wrote it down. The Ashford Tenant Farms, she said. I have been managing their accounts for 4 years. I will continue to do so. Under my direction, not through a steward who reports to you. He looked up from his notes. This one apparently had caught his attention. You have been managing your father's tenant farms. Yes, for 4 years. Yes, without anyone's knowledge. My father prefers not to examine the details of estate management. I prefer accuracy to comfortable ignorance. We have arrived at a functional arrangement. He regarded her for a moment. She could not quite read the expression. It was not one of the standard responses she had catalogued over years of watching powerful men in social situations. It was something closer to what she imagined genuine assessment looked like when it was not performing itself. Agreed, he said. She had one more condition. She had kept it for last, because it was the one she was least certain of, and she had been raised to negotiate from the strongest position first and the most uncertain one last. I want, she said, setting down her pen and looking at him directly, to understand what I am actually helping you accomplish. Not the entailment. The other thing. Whatever Cedric Harlow did, or has, that made you decide. I was the appropriate candidate, rather than a woman from a family with no connection to the Harlow estate. The parlour was very quiet. Her father looked at the table. Adrian looked at Vivienne for a long moment. Then he said, I intend to destroy Lord Harlow. Not financially. Not socially, though both will be consequences. I mean that I intend to remove his ability to operate in public life, to use his parliamentary position as a weapon, and to cause harm to people who cannot protect themselves from him. I have the means to do this. I have had the means for 11 years. I recently acquired the final piece I needed. He paused. The proximity your family's estate creates, the land boundary, the legal connections, the history, gives me legitimate grounds to act that I would not otherwise have. I needed you. That is the truth of it. Vivienne held his gaze. Do you have a problem with that? I have a problem, she said carefully, with being used without being informed. Now that I am informed, I find I have no problem whatsoever. She picked up her pen. She looked at him. He said very quietly, I should tell you. He will not go quietly. There will be consequences before it is resolved. I am already familiar, she said, with the consequences of Lord Harlow's methods. They are somewhat less alarming the second time. Something moved across his face that was not quite a smile. It was the shadow of one, the structural possibility of one, occurring in the face of a man who did, in the face of a man who did not smile, often enough for the muscles to manage it, without warning. She looked down at the paper. She wrote the final terms. When she looked up again, he was watching her with an expression she could not name. And she was a woman who could name most expressions, which unsettled her in a way she did not examine. Jennings, his secretary, was dispatched to the London Gazette before the ink on the private document had properly dried. The announcement of the betrothal of Miss Vivienne Ashford, eldest daughter of the Earl of Ashford, to Adrian Blackwell, Duke of Ravenswood, appeared in the next morning's edition. Vivienne read it over her breakfast with a cup of coffee, and the particular steadiness of a person who has made a decision and has no interest in revisiting it. It had been 4 days since Cedric's 2-sentence note. She thought it was a rather quick recovery, all things considered. Chapter 6. Adrian. The announcements affect the club at St. James's was in a state of suppressed excitement, which it expressed in the way English clubs always expressed excitement, by becoming very slightly quieter than usual. Adrian was aware, from the moment he walked through the door on the Thursday morning, following the Gazette announcement, that every man in the reading room had already processed the news, and had formed an opinion about it, and was now performing the collective fiction that no one had noticed his entrance. He ordered coffee. He took his usual chair, which no one ever occupied because no one sat in Adrian's chair, a fact that was not explained or enforced, but was simply understood in the manner of the unwritten social laws that governed spaces like this one. He opened the newspaper he had already read at home, because appearing occupied was useful in rooms where people were trying to decide whether to approach you. 3 men approached him with congratulations. He received them with the minimum necessary courtesy. 2 of them were fishing for information about why he had suddenly and without apparent romantic precedent announced a betrothal to the daughter of a financially troubled earl. He gave them nothing useful. The 3rd was genuinely pleased, an old military acquaintance who clasped his hand with honest warmth and said, "About bloody time, Blackwell, you're not getting younger," with the cheerful directness of a man who had survived 3 battles at his side and felt entitled to plainness. Adrian found he did not mind that one. In the afternoon, Jennings presented him with the day's correspondence. The 3rd letter in the stack was from the War Office. His contact, a careful, senior man named Broughton, who requested a private meeting with some urgency. That meeting happened at 4:30 in a room at the back of a coffee house near Whitehall that was used for conversations that were not supposed to have occurred. Broughton was a trim man with the permanent expression of someone calculating risk continuously. He sat across from Adrian with his hands folded on the table and said, very carefully, "The announcement in the Gazette has created certain anxieties. Among whom? Among people who would prefer the Harlow matter to remain a private rather than a public administration." He looked at Adrian directly. "You marrying into the family whose land borders the Harlow estate is not a coincidence that anyone in our office believes. I am not asking you to believe in coincidences. What you are building," Broughton said, "is a proximity to Harlow that could be read as preparation for a private campaign of destruction rather than a legitimate legal process. We would prefer the document be handed to the appropriate legal authorities and the matter handled through official channels. The appropriate legal authorities," Adrian said, "will handle it in private, issue a quiet administrative consequence, and have the whole matter buried in committee language within 6 months, because Cedric's father is dead and making it public would embarrass 2 ministries and a sitting cabinet member who knew and said nothing." He lifted his coffee cup. "I have seen how your office handles inconvenient truths. I am not interested in the process." Broughton looked at him with the expression of a man who was both frustrated and, underneath it, not entirely unsympathetic. "Do not do something that makes you a criminal, Blackwell." "I have been called worse things," Adrian said. He left the coffee house. He walked back to Ravenswood House in the cold afternoon, which he preferred to the carriage because the cold was honest. When he arrived home, Jennings was waiting with the day's remaining correspondence. One envelope was set apart from the others on the salver. Jennings said, without inflection, "This arrived by private messenger, Your Grace, from the Ashgate House." It was Cedric's handwriting. Adrian recognized it immediately. The beautiful copper plate that was as carefully constructed as everything else about the man. "My dear Ravenswood, I write to offer my warmest congratulations on the wonderful news of your betrothal. Miss Ashford is a most accomplished young woman, and I have no doubt she will be a duchess of great distinction. I confess the news came as some surprise, given the recent unfortunate circumstances, but I trust that love, as they say, takes no notice of such things. I wish you both every happiness. Yours in friendship, Harlow." Adrian read it once. He read it a second time, slowly, identifying the 4 separate mechanisms operating within its 27 lines. The false warmth, the reference to the unfortunate circumstances, which reminded everyone who might read this letter that the circumstances existed. The phrase, "I trust that love takes no notice," which planted the suggestion that the engagement was romantically motivated rather than strategic, making it easier to dismiss as impulsive. And the sign-off in friendship, which was a declaration that Cedric considered himself the one who could afford to be magnanimous. It was beautifully constructed. Adrian had, in the course of his career, decoded more sophisticated communications. But for sheer social mechanism, it was impressive. He stood. He walked through the house to the kitchen corridor and went downstairs to the kitchen fire himself, which caused the kitchen staff visible alarm because the Duke did not come downstairs. And he set the letter into the flames himself and watched it go. He did not want anyone else in the house to read it. Not because it would frighten them, but because he did not want Vivienne to see it and know that Cedric was already moving in response to the announcement. He needed to understand what Cedric was doing before she did. Because if she understood it before he had assessed it, she would respond before the strategy was complete. This was a rational calculation. He told himself this on the way back upstairs. He told himself this again. when he found himself standing in the upper corridor outside the door of the guest room, where Vivienne had been installed for the week before the wedding on the grounds that it was more convenient for the numerous practical arrangements requiring her attention. He had suggested it with a perfectly reasonable, practical rationale, and was now standing in a corridor at 2 a.m. with no particular rational justification. He could hear her moving on the other side of the door. She was awake. At 2 a.m, she was awake, and she was at the desk. He could tell by the specific quality of the sounds, the smooth and precise sounds of paper and movement, rather than the movements of a person distressed. He stood there for 4 minutes. He counted. He left without knocking. He went to the library. He picked up a military dispatch from the Vienna operation that he had already committed to memory. He read it anyway, because there was something about having words in front of you when the inside of your own head was too loud. Chapter 7, Vivienne. The Ton's verdict. The Countess of Drumore had made a calculation. It was not a sentimental calculation. The Countess was 61 years old and had navigated more social crises than most people had attended dinner parties, and she had learned that the most valuable position in London society was the one that predicted the next power alignment rather than the current one. She had assessed the situation. The Duke of Ravenswood, who terrified people and therefore commanded them. The Ashford girl, who was clearly more intelligent than her unfortunate recent circumstances. The Harlow business, which smelled like the kind of manufactured scandal that eventually turned on its creator. And she had decided that aligning with Ravenswood was worth rehabilitating a reputation. She had therefore thrown a ball. Specifically, she had thrown a ball to which she had invited every person who mattered and made it publicly known that the Duke of Ravenswood and his betrothed were attending. The social mathematics were simple. People who wished to be associated with Ravenswood would attend, which meant people who wished to be associated with the people associated with Ravenswood would attend, which meant the room would contain every significant figure in London society, and they would all be required to behave as though the last 3 weeks had not occurred. The note from Almack's arrived during the second hour of the ball. It was delivered to Vivienne discreetly by a footman who had been briefed to deliver it privately, which meant it was witnessed by approximately 11 people, which was the discreet version in a room of 200. She unfolded it. Her Almack's voucher was restored, with the warmest regards of the patronesses, with an intimation that they hoped to see her at the next assembly. She refolded it. She put it in her reticule. She turned to the woman beside her, the wife of a parliamentary minister who had been avoiding Vivienne's social circle for 2 weeks, and was now speaking to her with the careful enthusiasm of someone who understood she had made a tactical miscalculation. And she returned to the conversation about summer travel without acknowledging the note. Adrian was standing at the far end of the room. He had agreed to attend under the condition that he was not required to dance, which Vivienne had accepted because she had read enough about him to know that forcing him into a country dance would be counterproductive for everyone involved. He was managing the room from a position near the windows, not hiding, because hiding would have been conspicuous, but occupying a space that allowed him to see the room without being embedded in it. Men of his acquaintance came to him rather than the reverse. He spoke briefly and they went away, looking either relieved or carefully neutral. She watched this from across the room when she had a moment of observation available. He was, she thought, conducting social operations, with the same efficiency he had brought to the negotiation table. He was present. He was not performing. He was simply there, in the way that certain heavy objects are simply there, a feature of the landscape, rather than a gesture within it. She had been dancing for an hour. The dance cards that had been empty 3 weeks ago were now full, overfull, with men she recognized as having ignored her entirely during the Almack's period, and who were now recalibrating with the cheerful amnesia of people who had decided the recent past was best not examined. She was gracious. She was composed. She said the appropriate things to the appropriate people with the surface warmth that society required, and beneath that surface she was running the cold, continuous evaluation she had been running since Cedric's note, cataloguing information, assessing connections, noting which alliances were genuine and which were opportunistic and which were fearful. She was in the middle of this evaluation, speaking to the wife of Lord Morland about a charitable subscription, when she became aware of Cedric. He approached from the left, which meant he had come around the edge of the room rather than across it, which meant he had timed the approach deliberately rather than arriving incidentally. He was wearing a gold-trimmed coat that made him look like a figure on a commemorative coin. His expression was exactly right, open, regretful, warm with the particular warmth of a man who was performing personal cost. "Miss Ashford," he said. He inclined his head. "How pleasant to see you looking so well." "Lord Harlow," she said. The same warmth, the same level of inclination, the identical social register. "I wonder," he said, with the gentle presumption of someone who was certain of their own palatability, "if you might give me the honour of a dance, for old acquaintances' sake, and to demonstrate that there are no unpleasant feelings on either side." She was aware that Adrian had moved. He was still on the far side of the room. He was not approaching. He was watching. She looked at Cedric. She looked at his smile, which was the smile of a man who was entirely certain she was going to say yes, because saying yes was the gracious thing, the forgiving thing, the good girl thing. And he had relied on her being a good girl for long enough to have built his entire strategy on her continued cooperation with that project, she said with complete pleasantness. "I am afraid my dance card is quite full for this evening, Lord Harlow." She paused. "And every evening for the foreseeable future." She turned back to Lady Morland. "You were saying the subscription closes at the end of the month." Cedric stood for 2 seconds, which, in a ballroom, was a very long time to stand in the same spot without speaking. Then he moved away. Lady Morland watched him go. She turned back to Vivienne with an expression that was trying to be neutral and was not quite succeeding. "My dear," she said quietly, "that was extremely well done." Vivienne smiled. She said nothing. Across the room, Adrian was no longer watching Cedric. He was watching her. She could feel it from 40 feet away. Not a stare, not a performance of watching, but the particular quality of attention of someone who had set all other observations aside. He was looking at her the way she'd looked at account ledgers when she found an entry that contradicted what she had expected and needed to understand. Why? She looked back for a moment. Then she turned to her next dance partner, who arrived to claim her with the bashful energy of a young man who had clearly been working up to the approach for some time. She gave him her full attention. She did not think about the man across the room. She told herself this repeatedly, with limited success, for the remaining 2 hours of the ball. She turned down Cedric's dance request in front of 200 witnesses. She walked into that ballroom 3 weeks after he burned her reputation to the ground and left without a single visible wound. She found the one document in 20 years of estate records that changes everything. and she is just getting started. If you have been watching quietly, now is the time to make yourself known. Drop a comment below. Tell us where you are watching from. Tell us what you think of Vivienne. Tell us whether you trust Adrian yet. We are reading, we are here, and we will say hello. Stay with us. Chapter 8. Adrian. The document Broughton came to Ravenswood House this time, which was a shift from the coffee house meeting that Adrian recognised as meaning the situation had moved from caution to decision. He sat across from Adrian in the library and set a leather portfolio on the desk and did not immediately open it. "The authentication is complete," Broughton said. He had the voice of a man for whom every sentence was a calculation. "The signature is verified. The content is as we believed." He paused. "I want to be clear about the official position before you look at it. The official position is that this should go through the appropriate judicial process. That position has not changed." "I understand the position," Adrian said. "And you are going to do what you intended to do with it regardless." "I am going to do what serves the 47 men it concerns." Broughton opened the portfolio. The document was single-paged, aged, written in a hand that had been analysed and confirmed as belonging to the elder Viscount Ashgate. It described a communication with a French courier, a specific British regiment's position and anticipated movement, and payment received for the information. Adrian read it. He had read the partial version before. The complete version was both exactly what he had expected and seen in full somehow worse than expectation. He set it down. He said, the regiment was the 43rd Light Infantry. They were positioned near a village called Lousarches for a 3-day rest before moving to support the action near Compiègne. They were ambushed on the second night. 47 men. He stopped. He had not intended to say this out loud. He had said it anyway. I reached their position at dawn. The regiment had sent a rider for support at midnight. 3 hours. Broughton was quiet. The youngest was 19, Adrian said. His name was Thomas Hewitt. He had been in the army 4 months. His commanding officer told me he had been talking about his mother's apple orchard the day before. Broughton said, after a long pause, I understand why you want the public process. The public process, Adrian said, returning to his usual flatness, would bury it in committee and produce an administrative apology in 6 months. I want Cedric Harlow to spend the rest of his life knowing that I know, and I want him to spend the rest of his life calculating what I will do with it. He closed the portfolio. That is more punishment than a closed-door proceeding. Broughton looked at him. Using this as private leverage makes you a blackmailer, technically. I have been called worse things, Adrian said, for the second time in a week, by better men. Broughton took the portfolio back. He would make a copy available. They both understood the arrangement without stating its details. After Broughton left, Adrian went out through the back of the house to the mews. He needed air that was not the recycled air of professional conversations. The mews at this hour, early evening, the stable hands finished for the day, was dark and smelled of horses and hay, and the particular cold of a London March evening that got into the back of the throat. He stood there. He had been standing there for he did not know how long enough to feel cold properly, long enough that the noise of the street on the other side of the house had faded below the level of conscious awareness. He became aware of another presence. Not threatening, he would have been aware of a threatening presence much earlier. This was simply the awareness of another person at the edge of his peripheral vision, someone who had come out of the house through the kitchen passage and stopped when they saw him. And then, rather than retreating, had moved to stand approximately 6 feet away and was now standing in silence. He looked. Vivienne. She was wearing a dark wool coat over what appeared to be her evening dress. Clearly, she had come out without great preparation, and she was not looking at him. She was looking at the dark bulk of the stable wall with the expression of someone who had come out for a specific reason, unrelated to his presence, and was now coexisting with that presence with minimal social accommodation. He turned back to the wall himself. The silence between them was not comfortable exactly, but it was not uncomfortable either. It had the quality of silence between two people who were both capable of occupying a quiet space without feeling obligated to fill it. She said, after a while, "What does 40 feel like to carry?" He went completely still. He turned to look at her. She was looking at the wall still. Her profile was serious and contained in the way he had come to associate with her as her genuine default expression. Not cold, but precise. The face of a person who was actually thinking rather than performing thought. "How do you know that number?" he said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended. "There was a letter," she said, "in your library." "On the desk in the library, not filed or put away, just on the desk. I was looking for the estate maps for the Ashford tenant farm boundaries. I saw it, I read it." She turned to look at him now. Her eyes were steady in the dim light of the mews. "I am not apologetic about it. I thought you should know that I know." He stared at her. She waited. He turned back to the wall. The cold of the March evening was settling into his coat. He thought about telling her it was not her concern. He thought about the 4 standard responses he had given to the 4 standard versions of this inquiry over 11 years. The deflection, the professional summary, the anger, the silence. He said, instead, from somewhere below his usual calculation, "It feels like a number that should be larger." She was quiet. "It feels like a number that, when it is small enough to have a name, is worse than when it is large enough to be a statistic." He stopped. "I have made decisions that condemned hundreds. In war, that is understood as necessary. The mathematics of command. The 47 are different because the mathematics were corrupted by someone who should have been on the same side." Vivienne said nothing for a moment. Then, "What were their names?" He looked at her. "The ones you knew," she said. He told her, all 12. He had not said them out loud in 11 years, and they came without effort, because you did not forget the names of men whose faces you had identified at dawn. She listened. She did not offer condolence. She did not say it was not his fault, or that he had done what he could, or any of the things that people said when they were trying to fill the silence rather than hold it. She simply listened, which was the more difficult and more honest response. When he had finished, she said, "I am glad you are going to do something about it." That was all she said. They stood in the mews, in the cold for a while longer, neither of them speaking. Then she said, "The estate maps are on the second shelf of the bookcase, right side. They are rolled and tied with red ribbon." She turned and went back inside through the kitchen passage. He stood there another moment. He thought, "I do not know what to do with that woman," he thought with slightly more accuracy. "I have never met anyone like that woman." He went back inside. Chapter 9, Vivienne. The ceremony was at St. George's, Hanover Square, which was the correct church for a wedding of this social weight. And Vivienne stood in the vestibule in her ivory silk dress. Not white, which was a young girl's colour, but the warm ivory of a woman who had chosen her dress with the same deliberate intelligence she brought to everything, and thought about what she was legally about to do. She thought about it because she had decided, several weeks ago, that she would not perform at her own wedding. She would not perform serenity or joy, or romantic anticipation. She would be entirely honest with herself for the duration of the ceremony, even if she was performing some appropriate for the benefit of the witnesses, because the ceremony itself was important enough to look at clearly. What she was legally about to do was this. She was about to sign away her independent legal existence. Under the doctrine of coverture, which was not an abstract legal concept but a structural reality, a wall built into the architecture of her society, a married woman had no separate legal standing from her husband. Her property transferred to him, her debts became his, her legal capacity to enter contracts, to sue, to be sued, to own. All of it transferred the moment the register was signed. She was walking into a legal annihilation. She knew this. She had researched it thoroughly. She had discussed it with her solicitor, and then with Adrian's solicitor, and then, late at night, with Adrian himself, who had listened to her full articulation of what she understood herself to be doing, and then said, yes. And in exchange, you become the one person in England that no one can legally or socially damage without going through me first. I understand the cost. I hope you consider the return sufficient. She had considered it. She was still considering it, here in the vestibule, with her father's arm under her hand, and Clara behind her in pale green silk, looking both nervous and excited in the way of a 17-year-old who was attending her first major event as a family member of consequence rather than a peripheral figure. What she was choosing was not the annihilation. It never had been. What she was choosing was the weapon. She walked down the aisle. Adrian was standing at the front of the church in black, as he always was, with that stillness that she had initially read as coldness and now read as economy. A man who did not expend energy on performances that served no purpose. He turned when she came level with the first pew. He looked at her with the direct, assessing attention she had come to recognize as his version of acknowledgement. She thought, with the dry internal commentary that served as her private running narration, he looks like a man about to negotiate a treaty, not receive a wife. And then again, so do I, probably. We are well matched in at least this. The ceremony was brief and serious. The vows were the traditional words, spoken by both of them without embellishment. When the register was signed, she felt the legal shift as a physical fact, not dramatic, not painful, just a fact, like a door closing. The door that opened was larger. The wedding breakfast was held at Ravenswood House, and it was there that Cedric made his final move. He had been permitted an invitation, because refusing it would have looked like fear. And Vivienne had decided deliberately that she was not going to look like fear. He arrived with 3 guests she recognized, and one she did not. A woman of perhaps 35, dressed well but not extravagantly, with a careful, practiced expression that Vivienne's internal assessment identified within 40 seconds as the expression of someone who had been coached on a story. She watched the woman from across the room. She watched Cedric speak to her twice in the first 40 minutes of the breakfast, each time briefly, each time with the appearance of a host greeting a guest, and each time the woman's careful expression became slightly more resolved. She was preparing to speak. To whom or about what? Vivienne did not know specifically, but the body language was unmistakable. The gathering of intention, the settling of nerves, the small adjustment of posture that preceded a rehearsed statement. Vivienne set down her glass. She did not look at Adrian. He was at the far end of the room, in conversation with 3 men from his parliamentary acquaintance. She did not need his attention for this. She crossed the room. She reached the woman before she could approach anyone, "How kind of you to come," Vivienne said, with the exact warmth of a hostess greeting a guest she was pleased to see. She took the woman's arm with gentle firmness and guided her toward the window embrasure, which was removed from the main conversation by sufficient distance to allow a private exchange. "I do not believe we have been formally introduced." The woman gave her name. Vivienne listened. She gave the woman precisely 3 seconds to settle into the prepared version of events that she had clearly been given. Then Vivienne said quietly, without any change of expression, "I know that you are here at Lord Harlow's request to speak on a particular matter related to an event that did not occur." She paused. "I also know that Lord Harlow has not told you what he has told you is false, because that would be an awkward conversation. What he has told you, I imagine, is that speaking publicly on this matter will benefit you in a specific financial way." The woman's careful expression flickered. "I know the state of your finances," Vivienne continued, still in the pleasant tone one used for light conversation at social events. "I know that Lord Harlow owes you money from a specific transaction in 1818 that he has been avoiding settling. I know that he has promised you the debt resolution is contingent on your assistance today." She looked at the woman directly. "What he has not told you is that his own financial situation is at this moment considerably worse than yours. He cannot honour the debt. And if you speak today, your name will be part of a very public account of a deliberate and coordinated campaign of social destruction that will not end well for anyone who participated willingly." The woman stared at her. "However," Vivienne said, "if you leave this breakfast within the next 10 minutes and go directly home and have nothing further to do with Lord Harlow's projects, I will have no reason to mention your involvement in anything to anyone." She smiled. It was a perfectly warm social smile. It is a genuinely simple choice. The woman left within 9 minutes. Vivienne returned to the main room. She accepted a glass of champagne from a passing footman. She found herself standing near the fireplace, and when she looked across the room, Adrian was looking at her. He had not intervened. He had not moved from his position. He had simply watched. She could see it in his face, the quality of having observed rather than participated, and in his expression something she had not seen on him before. It was, she thought, something like pride. She looked at it from across the room and felt something shift in her own chest that she did not immediately examine. The carriage to Ravenswood Park was ready at 3 o'clock. They had 40 miles of Yorkshire road ahead of them, which meant approximately 4 hours of travel, and for the first 30 miles, neither of them spoke. She looked at the dark countryside moving past the window. She thought about the day. She thought about the register and the legal shift and the woman at the window embrasure and the expression on Adrian's face across the room. At 30 miles, she said, into the dark of the carriage, "Teach me to shoot." He turned from the window. "Properly," she said. "Not the ladylike version where one holds the pistol at arm's length and hopes for the best. The way you shoot." A pause. "Why?" he said. "Because," she said, "I have spent last several weeks understanding that I have been conducting all of my important conflicts without the full complement of available options. I would like to correct that." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "We begin tomorrow morning." She turned back to the window. She was, she thought, oddly content. Chapter 10. Adrian. Ravenswood Park rose from the Yorkshire Dales like a statement, not a declaration. Too grand a word for something that was not trying to impress. More like a statement in the architectural sense. Here is what this family believes a house should be. It said permanence, utility, the kind of beauty that had not been designed for pleasure, but had accumulated through the accumulation of proper decisions. Stone walls 3 feet thick, windows that let in the grey Yorkshire light without apology, grounds that were beautiful the way a disciplined mind is beautiful, without unnecessary ornament, with everything in its correct position. Adrian watched Vivienne's face as the carriage came up the long drive. She was not overwhelmed. She was doing what she always did with new information, cataloguing it. He could follow the movement of her attention as it moved across the facade, the east wing, the older portion, the north face, more recent by perhaps 50 years, the walled kitchen garden, the stables, the landscape geometry of the grounds. She was making plans. He found this simultaneously reassuring and faintly alarming. Mrs. Hartley received them at the door, with the staff assembled in the great hall. 32 indoor staff, all watching the new Duchess of Ravenswood with the particular assessment that long-serving households applied to the unknown quantity of a new mistress. Vivienne moved down the line with the composed attention she brought to every person who spoke to her, which Adrian noted made people visibly more comfortable, even before she had said anything specific. On the second morning, she asked for the household accounts. Mrs. Hartley brought them to the library. Vivienne read them at the large table for 2 hours. Adrian worked at the opposite end of the same table, because this was the room where work happened, and he saw no reason to vacate it simply because she was in it. At the end of the 2 hours, she set down the final ledger and said, "The kitchen expenditure is incorrect by approximately 11% annually, which suggests either the records are being kept by someone who does not understand the difference between a weekly and a monthly figure, or there is a small consistent discrepancy that has been normalized over time. I would like to speak with Mrs. Hartley about it." He looked up from his correspondence. "Also," she said, "the east wing drainage appears in the estate records as requiring repair 3 times in the last 6 years, with the repair never completed. That suggests a structural issue rather than a maintenance issue. I would like to have a surveyor in before the end of the month." "The east wing," he said, "is not in use. I am aware it is not in use," she said, with the patience of a woman who has stated the obvious and is working toward a point. "I would like to know whether that is because of the drainage or because of another reason." He set down his pen. He said, in the flattest voice he possessed, which was very flat, "It was my wife's, my first wife, her rooms, her things." He paused. "She died 3 years into the marriage. The child did not survive." Vivienne went completely still. He watched her absorb it. He watched her understand, with the quick precision she brought to everything, that this information had not been in her research, had not been in the negotiation, had been an entire chapter of his life that she had not known existed. He waited for her to say something, the usual things, the kind, careful, socially navigated things that people said when they found themselves in proximity to grief they had not prepared for. She said nothing. He walked out of the room. He went down the corridor toward the east wing and stood in the small anteroom at the far end of the house, where the corridor terminated, in front of the closed doors of Catherine's rooms. He stood there for a few minutes. He had not been here in 2 years. When he came back down the main corridor an hour later, Vivienne was sitting on the floor in front of the east wing doors. Not inside. She had not opened them. She was sitting cross-legged on the cold stone floor. In front of the closed doors, her back against the wall, a small book open in her lap, reading. She did not look up when he came down the corridor. She did not move. He stopped. He looked at her. This woman he had married for pragmatic reasons, sitting on his cold stone floor outside the room. He had locked 2 years ago, because he did not know what to do with the weight of it. She had not opened the door. She had not retreated. She was simply there, occupying the space between the door and the rest of the house, as if she was refusing to let the distance between those two things become permanent. He did not know what to say. He went back to the library, but he left the door open. Chapter 11. Vivienne, the counterattack. The letter from her father arrived on a Tuesday. It was brief, because her father's correspondence was always brief when he was trying to control his own alarm. He wrote shorter when he was frightened, as if reducing the words reduced the reality. She read it standing at the window of the Ravenswood library with the cold Yorkshire morning outside, and felt a specific cold rage settle through her like snow. Cedric had filed a boundary dispute claim in Chancery Court. The claim, as her father's solicitor had communicated it, was precise and technically sophisticated. The kind of legal construction that required a real solicitor with real knowledge rather than the kind that Cedric appeared to have generated spontaneously from wounded pride, which meant he had been planning this before the wedding, which meant the claim had been prepared before her wedding to Adrian, possibly before the engagement announcement, possibly as early as the original withdrawal of the betrothal. She understood very clearly what the claim was designed to do. It targeted the most productive farming acreage of the Ashford estate, the eastern boundary land, the portion that ran along the border with Harlow property, the portion that was currently producing the only genuine income that the estate was generating. If the claim succeeded, that acreage transferred to Harlow ownership. If the claim was contested, the legal costs would consume what remained of the estate's liquidity. Either outcome destroyed the viability of Ashford Park as a functional property. He was not trying to win land. He was trying to make sure there was nothing left worth saving. She spent 2 hours in the library being extremely still, which was what she did, instead of what most people would call reaction. Then she went to Adrian and said she needed 3 days at Ashford Park. He said, "I will come with you," she said. "You will not." He looked at her with the expression she had begun to identify as the expression he used when he disagreed with something, but was assessing whether the disagreement was worth stating. "I need to look through 20 years of estate records," she said. "I know where they are. I know how they are organized, which is not well. I know what I am looking for. If you come, you will want to be useful, and your version of useful will involve people who are not property documents. This is a documents problem. I do my best documents work alone. You are going without a guard. I am going with Jennings, who you can spare, and with Jenny E., who cannot be intimidated by anyone. And I am going to my father's house in the middle of Yorkshire, not into a criminal enterprise." He considered this for a moment. 2 days, he said, not 3. She accepted 2 days and got the 3rd anyway, which she suspected he had known she would. Ashford Park in March was cold and slightly reduced looking in the way of houses that were being maintained below their proper standard. Small economies that individually meant nothing but collectively gave the impression of a property quietly beginning its surrender. She noticed each of them with the unhappy precision of a person who loves a place and is watching it diminish. Her father was thinner. He was trying not to be alarmed in front of her, which meant he was considerably more alarmed than he appeared. She sent him to bed on the first evening and went to the estate office. She went through the records with the systematic thoroughness she applied to any problem she considered important. The filing system was, as she had predicted, organized according to her father's particular logic, which was not immediately legible, but was, once understood, navigable. She worked by candlelight because beeswax, not the tallow that was used in the servants' hall. She would not conduct important work in the smell of tallow, which was the smell of unimportant things. On the second morning, she found the deed from 1743. It was folded inside a folio of conveyancing documents from her great-great-grandfather's estate management, which had been filed between two volumes of household accounts from 1739, because whoever had filed it had been guided by chronology rather than category. It was thin, fragile at the fold lines, written in the formal legal hand of the mid-18th century. She read it twice. She sat back in the hard chair of the estate office at 2:30 in the morning and thought about what she was holding. The 1743 deed established the boundary between Ashford and the adjacent property, which had been Harlow land for approximately 60 years, previously belonging to a different family, at a specific survey point that was 700 yards east of the point that Cedric's Chancery claim was using as its baseline. 700 yards. On a property of this size, 700 yards was significant. The deed was the counterclaim, but it was more than the counterclaim, because when she went through the remaining files on that second morning, she found a letter from Cedric, written 18 months ago, before the engagement ended, while he was still presenting himself as a man of honour who was earnestly seeking a suitable match. A letter to her father that contained, in its discussion of the boundary lands, a specific reference to the 1743 deed point as the established boundary. As both families have long understood, Cedric had written, "The surveyed line from the 1743 deed represents the settled understanding of both estates." He had written down the same boundary point that his Chancery claim now disputed. He had stated it as settled fact, in writing. His Chancery filing was perjury. She folded both documents. She put them in a leather folio. She blew out her candle and sat in the dark for a moment, thinking about the nature of overreach, about the specific failure mode of men who believed their own performance so completely that they stopped auditing it for accuracy. She arrived back at Ravenswood at midnight on the second day. Adrian was in the library. She had expected this. She had not expected that seeing him there, in the chair at the far end of the table, in the lamplight, with the habitual stillness that had stopped alarming her somewhere around the third week, would produce the specific warmth she felt when she came through the door. She filed this away without examining it and walked to the desk. She set the leather folio in front of him. She said, "The 1743 deed establishes the boundary at a point that defeats his Chancery claim entirely. The letter from 18 months ago constitutes perjury. He stated the correct boundary in writing, then filed a claim that contradicts that statement." She sat down across from him. "I found your sword. Tell me when we use it." He looked at the documents. He read them both slowly. He looked up. He said, "Vivienne, not Miss Ashford," which was what he had used for the first weeks. Not Duchess, which was what the staff called her. Not the impersonal formality he defaulted to in conversation. Her name. Like it was a thing that had specific weight. She held herself very still. She said, "When?" "Soon," he said. She understood why he said it. That soon meant something precise. That the mechanism was already in motion. That she had just handed him the final piece and the only remaining question was the order of moves. She looked at the fire. She thought about the east wing. About the door she had sat in front of without opening. About the name Catherine that she had not said to him and he had not offered again. She thought about the 47 men and the 12 she now knew by name. She thought, "I married this man to survive." and I think I may have made an error in my original accounting. She did not say any of this. She said, I am going to bed. Do not stay up until 4 in the morning reading dispatches you have memorized. She left the library. Behind her, the fire crackled. She heard him say very quietly to the empty room, or possibly to her, thank you. She kept walking. 11 days. That is all it takes to dismantle a man who thought he was untouchable. The Chancery claim, the parliamentary allies, the credit notes, the sealed inquiry, each piece already in motion, but Vivienne wants to be the one to end it herself, in person, face to face. If someone sent you this video, if you found this story through a friend or a recommendation, go and subscribe right now so you never have to search for us again. Every story we tell is for people who believe that women like Vivienne deserve to have their names on their own work. The confrontation is coming. Do not go anywhere. Chapter 12, Adrian. The trap closes. The mechanics of Cedric's destruction took 11 days. Adrian had learned, over the course of his career, that the best executed operations were to serve ones that appeared to require no coordination at all, where each element seemed to occur independently, naturally, as though the world itself had simply grown tired of the subject and was correcting itself. Day 1. Through a parliamentary acquaintance whose opinion in judicial appointments carried significant weight, he arranged for the Chancery Court boundary claim to be assigned to a judge named Pemberton, a man of 63 who had spent his career in property law, who was constitutionally incapable of procedural laziness, and who had, upon reviewing the 1743 deed and the 1818 letter, immediately identified both the historical basis for the counterclaim and the perjury issue without being told to look for them. Day 3. Broughton's office issued a formal summons to Lord Cedric Harlow, requiring his attendance at a private government inquiry related to wartime intelligence matters connected to the late Viscount Ashgate. The summons used the language of administrative procedure, which meant it sounded routine to anyone who did not know what it meant, and meant catastrophe to anyone who did. Cedric knew exactly what it meant. Day 5. Through a careful and entirely incidental conversation at his club, Adrian mentioned to 2 men simultaneously, men who were both members of the same financial networks that Cedric relied upon for his credit, arrangements, that he had heard Harlow's notes were running rather long. This was the social equivalent of pulling a single thread in a knit. The financial community's first instinct, upon hearing that a nobleman's credit position was uncertain, was to examine one's own exposure. Within 48 hours, 3 of Cedric's principal moneylenders were reviewing their positions. Day 7. The Chancery claim was dismissed. Day 9. The first of Cedric's parliamentary allies withdrew from a committee co-signing arrangement he had been relying on, citing a need to review his own commitments. Adrian received reports of each movement through the network he had spent 14 years building in, positions he was not supposed to use for personal matters. He used them anyway because he had made Vivienne a promise, and he intended to keep it with the same precision he had applied to every commitment he had made in his professional life, most of which had been grimmer. On the 10th day, the letter arrived. It was addressed to Miss Clara Ashford, care of the Ashford Park estate, and it was forwarded to Ravenswood by the estate steward because all correspondence for the Ashford family was being routed there during the period of legal sensitivity. The steward had followed this instruction correctly without knowing why it had been given. Adrian's secretary brought it to him because it was from a London address he had flagged for monitoring 3 weeks earlier. It was Cedric's handwriting. Adrian read it. It was a love letter. Or rather, it was the opening move of a courtship campaign, charming, flattering, carefully calibrated to appeal to a 17-year-old girl who had been told she was about to have her first London season. It spoke of chance encounters at the Drummore Ball. Clara had been there. She had been pointed out to Cedric. She had obviously made an impression, and of a hope that their acquaintance might be renewed in more formal terms. It was perfectly gracious. It contained nothing that could be objected to on any individual basis. It was also, unmistakably, Cedric pivoting. The Ashford land. Vivienne was out of reach. But Clara would, eventually, inherit the title claim on the estate when the Earl died without a male heir. A marriage to Clara, who was 17, who had been given a first season full of romantic possibility, who had no reason yet to understand what Cedric was capable of, would give him everything he had been attempting to obtain by other means. He was willing to wait. He was willing to begin again. Adrian folded the letter. He found Vivienne in the East Wing. The East Wing was not open. The door to Catherine's rooms was still closed. But Vivienne had begun using the anteroom at the top of the corridor as a small working room. She had moved a writing table there. The light from the east-facing windows in the morning was, she had explained, considerably better for document work than the library's north-facing aspect. He understood that she was, slowly and without stating it, bringing the corridor back into use, returning it to the category of inhabited house rather than locked memory. He had not discussed this with her. He had noted it. He had not asked her to stop. He handed her the letter. She read it. She folded it. She held it for a moment. Her expression was the precise, still expression she used for problems that required all of her attention. Then she looked up at him. I want to be the one to end this. Vivienne, not through Chancery, not through the parliamentary procedure, in person. She set the letter down. I want to face him. I want to be the one who tells him what is already in motion and what will happen if he does not remove himself from this entirely. I want him to hear it from me. There is no safety consideration that permits. I am not asking for your permission, she said. It was not said in anger. It was said in the simple level tone she used when she was stating a fact. He looked at her. He thought about arguing. He thought about all the reasons it was strategically inadvisable, emotionally unnecessary, practically hazardous. He thought about her face when she had come back from the Drummore Ball, the way she had crossed the dance floor towards Cedric and declined his request and turned her back on him in front of 200 witnesses, the way she had handled the woman at the wedding breakfast without anyone's help. He thought about the fact that she had earned this. I will be there, he said. Visible or not, I will be there. Far enough not to intervene, she said. Close enough to act if needed. She considered this. She nodded. That is acceptable. She turned back to her writing table. She picked up her pen. She said, without looking up, Clara will not see this letter. No, he said, she will not. She wrote something. He stood for a moment. He was about to leave, and then he said something he had not planned to say. You are the most capable person I have ever had occasion to rely on. He said it in the flat, direct way he said everything, which meant it had no veneer over it, no social management. It was just a statement of the thing that was true. I thought you should know that I know it. She looked up from her writing. She looked at him for a long moment, with an expression he could not name, but that made something in his chest do something that he chose not to examine immediately. She said, Go away, Adrian, I am trying to work. He went. He was. He recognized with the uncomfortable clarity of someone unused to the sensation, smiling. Chapter 13. Vivienne. The confrontation, the pump room at Bath, was golden in the morning light. She had chosen it deliberately, as she chose everything now, for its specific qualities, its specific meanings, its specific place in her personal history with the man she was about to dismantle. She and Cedric had attended a concert here during the previous spring, during the height of their engagement, when he had been at his most convincing and she had been at her most hopeful. He had stood in this room and told her about his family's history and his plans for his estate, and she had listened and believed him because he was telling her the truth about those things, even as he had been lying about the things that mattered more. She had chosen this room because she wanted him to feel the distance between that man and the one who was going to be standing in front of her today. She wanted him to feel the specific shame of being seen clearly by someone he had assumed would never see clearly. She arrived at 9 o'clock. The room was populated with the usual Bath morning crowd, the invalids taking the waters, the older visitors seeking the particular social pace of a city that moved more slowly than London, several families, with daughters who were being tried on the provincial social circuit before the London season. It was public enough to be safe. It was sedate enough that any conversation could be held at low volume without being overheard. Adrian was there. She had seen him from the street, stationed with the unhurried naturalness of a man who happened to be present, far enough to give her the room she needed, in a position that gave him unobstructed sight lines to the entire floor and to the 3 exits. She had nodded at him once from across the street. He had not waved. He had simply noted her. She went inside. Cedric was already there. She had sent him a brief note the previous day, stating that she wished to discuss a matter of mutual interest before either party proceeded further with any legal arrangements. She had kept it neutral, which she knew he would read as an overture, as the exhausted woman coming to the negotiating table because the position had become untenable. She had known he would read it that way. She had let him. He was wearing a navy coat. His hair was perfectly arranged. He looked, as he always looked, like the most reasonable man in the room. "Miss Ash, my apologies," he said, with the careful correction of a man who knew her title had changed. "Duchess, how extraordinary to see you looking so well." "Lord Harlow," she said. She walked toward the window. She did not sit. She stood, because standing allowed her to choose when the conversation ended, and sitting allowed him to control the timing by declining to stand. He moved to stand near her, adopting the social posture of a concerned friend, turned slightly toward her, a degree or two closer than strictly necessary, which was a habit she had once found warm and now read as a management technique. She said, without preliminary, "The Chancery claim has been dismissed." His expression did not change. "Yes, a temporary setback. My solicitors, the boundary dispute cannot be refiled in Chancery or any other court," she said. "The 1743 deed and the letter you wrote to my father in 1818 have been reviewed by the court. The matter is settled." She watched him process this. The adjustment was subtle but visible, a small recalibration of his expectations. "Furthermore," she said, "you have received a summons to a government inquiry. You know what the inquiry concerns. You understand what the document contains and what it proves about your father's activities in 1813. She looked at him steadily. "I know what the document says. I know what 47 men means. I know who they were, because my husband told me their names." Something moved in Cedric's face that was not the performed warmth, or the performed grief, or the performed magnanimity. It was a flash of something real, not remorse, but fear. The specific fear of a man who has been conducting his entire life on the assumption that a particular truth would never be spoken aloud. Your parliamentary allies have begun withdrawing, she continued. Your credit notes are being reviewed by your principal moneylenders. These things are already in motion and will proceed to their natural conclusions regardless of what happens in this room today. She stopped. She let the silence sit. Cedric said, after a moment, in a voice that was very careful, "What do you want?" "I want you to leave London within 30 days, she said. "I want you to withdraw from your parliamentary seat on grounds of personal health. That reason is available. It is the one people use when they need a narrative that does not require public explanation. I want you to retire to the Harlow property in Ireland, the small one, not Ashgate." She paused. "If you do these things, the inquiry will conclude with an administrative record that is sealed and not made public. The full document will not be introduced in a public forum. Your father's name will remain a private matter rather than a national scandal." He looked at her for a long moment. "And if I decline?" he asked. "Then everything becomes public," she said simply. "The inquiry, the 47 men, your father's treason, the perjury in the boundary claim, the letter to my sister, which has been retained." She held his gaze. "You will lose everything either way. The question is whether your name survives it." He was silent for a moment. She watched him calculate. She had learned enough about how he operated to recognize the process. The quick internal assessment of every available option, the searching for the move she had not anticipated, the testing of the structural integrity of what she had constructed. There was no gap. She had made sure of that. He said, finally, with the genuine hatred he had previously been so good at concealing, "Why are you giving me the option to run? You could destroy me publicly. I would have destroyed you without offering an exit." "Yes," she said, "you would have. That is one of the ways in which we are different." "That is sentiment," he said with contempt. "That is exactly the same soft mercy that made you manageable." "No," she said, "it is not for your sake." She looked at him directly. "My husband has carried 47 names for 11 years. I will not ask him to carry a public trial and all its requirement for testimony and memory and reliving on top of that. He has already paid the cost of your father's actions. He does not need to pay it again for the pleasure of watching you answer for it in a public court." Cedric stared at her. "I am doing it for him," she said, "not for you." The silence in the pump room was the ambient silence of the morning crowd, which continued around them with complete indifference to the fact that something had just been permanently concluded. Cedric said, in the quietest voice she had ever heard from him, "He does not deserve you." "I know," she said. "He deserves better. Someone who chose him without a contract behind it, without debt as the initial motivation, without a social catastrophe as the precondition." She kept her eyes on his. "I intend to spend the rest of my life making sure he knows I would choose him again, without any of it. Without the crisis, without the offer, without the legal machinery. I would choose him, because he is the only person I have ever met who did not require me to be less than I am." She picked up her gloves from where she had set them on the window sill. She put them on. 30 days, Lord Harlow," she said. She turned and walked toward the door. The morning crowd moved around her. She walked through them without haste, without looking back, without any of the hurried relief of a person who has completed something they were afraid of. She had not been afraid. She had been, if she was honest with herself, ready for this, since the moment she had heard two women laughing from the window of her father's house on Berkeley Street. She came through the main door of the pump room into the Bath morning. Adrian was at the carriage. He was standing with one hand on the door, looking toward her as she came out, and she could tell, from 30 feet away, that he had seen nothing of what had passed inside, but had read her face, the way she had learned to read his. For the specific quality of information that the face gave when the social management was absent. He looked at her face. She walked to him. He said, "Is it done?" "It is done," she said. He took her hand. He did not let it go when she stepped into the carriage. He sat beside her rather than across from her, and he kept her hand in both of his, and they did not speak for a long time. The Yorkshire road was long and quiet and grey-skied ahead of them. She put her head on his shoulder. She felt his arm come around her. She thought about the east wing doors, about the letter she had been writing for 2 years in her small hours, about Clara's season, which would be everything it should be, about her father sleeping better than he had in years, about 47 names that she had now said back to their carrier, so he knew they were not his alone to carry. She thought about the woman she had been performing for the first 23 years of her life, and the woman she was now, in the carriage, going home, with a man who was the first person who had ever been frightening and safe in exactly the same measure. She closed her eyes. The road was long. It was perfectly sufficient. Chapter 14. Vivienne and Adrian. The aftermath 3 months later. The east wing was open. Not as it had been, not as Catherine's rooms, preserved in the careful amber of grief. Vivienne had done something more honest than preservation and more respectful than erasure. She had, over 3 weeks in January, had the rooms cleared of their specific personal contents, which were catalogued and boxed and stored with the care that they deserved, and then had the wing repainted and refitted with the thing that Ravenswood Park had needed for 20 years, and had lacked the female intelligence to implement a proper library. The Ravenswood Library had, she informed Adrian one morning in December, been operating at approximately 70% of its actual book capacity because the shelving system had been organised by acquisition date rather than any rational taxonomy, resulting in a situation where 400 volumes were stacked horizontally on top of the standing volumes in a configuration that was, she said, the intellectual equivalent of putting a guest in the attic, because the main bedrooms haven't been properly organised. She had not framed this as a question. The east wing was now a library. It was also because Vivienne had a practical approach to space that Adrian was learning to recognise as a form of genius, a proper working room, 2 large desks, good light from the east-facing windows in the morning, a fire that was maintained to a consistent temperature rather than the variable heat of a room that was used irregularly. She was there most mornings by 8 o'clock. Adrian went to find her there, often on the pretext of various practical matters, and while he was a man who did not examine his own motivations with excessive frequency, he understood that the pretexts were not the actual reason he went. Her father had spent 2 weeks at Ravenswood in February. He had arrived looking like a man who had been carrying a weight for a long time and was not certain how to set it down. He had left looking, as Vivienne said simply, like himself. The financial anxiety had been resolved. The estate was still modest, but the chancery matter was closed, and the tenant farm income, under Vivienne's management, had turned genuine profit for the first time in 11 years. He slept well. He ate well. He argued cheerfully with Adrian about the relative merits of different Yorkshire land management approaches, and was gently surprised to discover that Adrian found the argument interesting. Clara's debut season was being planned with the methodical excitement of a campaign. Vivienne had taken this on as a project that was simultaneously practical and, Adrian suspected, personally joyful in a way she did not fully acknowledge. She wrote to the patronesses of Almack's with the specific combination of social authority and personal warmth that came from being both a duchess and a woman who had once lost those vouchers and knew exactly what they meant. She arranged the presentation. Shessa collected the subscription rooms. She wrote Clara letters that were practical and warm and contained. Adrian noticed when he read one by accident several pieces of advice that were not the conventional advice given to young women about how to be pleasing to prospective husbands, but were instead advice about how to know your own mind before anyone else's opinion of you had a chance to organise itself in your head. Cedric Harlow was in Ireland. He had gone within the 30 days. His parliamentary resignation had cited personal health. The inquiry record was sealed. His name was not spoken at Ravenswood, not from taboo, but from simple irrelevance. He had ceased to be a factor in the operating reality of their lives. And Vivienne had a brisk philosophy about the energy cost of maintaining animosity toward things that were no longer threats. Adrian had found her in the library late one evening, in February, sitting very still at her desk, and he had known, without asking, that she was thinking about the 47 men, because he recognized the quality of the stillness as related to the quality of thought that had a specific cost. He had sat down. He had not said anything immediately. She had said, after a while, "Tell me the rest of them." He had looked at her. "I know the 12 you knew, personally," she said. "Tell me the others. All of them." He had told her. All 35 names he knew by record rather than by face. Read from the dispatch he had received the morning after the attack and committed to memory in 1813, because he had not been able to bear the idea of them being known only to paper. She had listened to everyone. She had said nothing until the last. And she had said them back. Not all 35. She had not had them as long as he had. But she said back as many as she had held, and she said them correctly. And she said them in the tone of a person who intended to continue saying them until she knew them all. He had sat in the library in the East Wing and felt something shift in his chest that was not the movement of grief being managed or pain being controlled, but was something entirely unlike what he was accustomed to feeling, which was the particular ache of something beginning rather than something closing. He thought about this sometimes in the mornings before she was awake, in the particular silence of Ravenswood, before the household came to life. He thought about the man he had been before. Not a different man exactly, but a man for whom the world's dimensions had been narrower, who had understood power and strategy and the specific textures of obligation and guilt and the long arithmetic of war, but who had not had access to the dimension that was available to him now, which was simply being known. He had been a weapon for 14 years. He had been good at it. He still was. But weapons were not designed for what he was discovering he wanted. The morning he found her in the East Wing library at midnight was in late March. He had been working late. A parliamentary matter, one of the reform discussions that his contact Broughton had pulled him into, somewhat against his inclination, on the basis that a man of his influence, who was interested in intelligent legislation, ought to put his name behind it, rather than merely fund it, from the margins. He had found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he was interested. He had found that sitting in committee rooms arguing about the mechanics of property law and inheritance reform engaged the same part of his mind that had enjoyed the Vienna Treaty negotiations, the part that was interested in structural problems and their structural solutions. He came upstairs at 11:30 and saw the light under the East Wing library door. He pushed it open. She was at her desk. She was writing, which was not unusual. She wrote most evenings, correspondence or estate notes, or the occasional letter to a woman who ran a charitable school in Leeds, whom she had begun advising on record-keeping. But this was different. She was writing with a particular quality of attention, the absorbed, slightly hunched quality of a person who was not writing for function, but for thought. He came in. She did not look up immediately, which meant she was at a point that required finishing before interruption. He looked at the desk. She had pages spread across the surface, not the estate ledgers, not correspondence, but pages of closer writing, more formal in construction, with marginal notes and crossed-out passages, and the marks of something being revised rather than composed fresh. She looked up. "What is that?" he said. She looked at him for a moment with the expression she used when she was deciding how much to say. Then she said, "I have been writing something for 2 years, before we met, before all of this. I started it when I first understood how the entailment laws worked and how they were going to determine the rest of my life, regardless of my own competence or effort." He waited. "It is a treatise," she said, "on land management and entailment law reform. The practical effects of current law on families like mine, and specific proposals for legislative change that would, among other things, prevent the situation that nearly destroyed my father from being replicated in 1,000 other families across England." She looked at him steadily. "I have been finishing it. It is nearly complete. And I have been writing to a publisher about the possibility of printing it." She paused. "Under a male pseudonym," she added, in the tone of a person who was not embarrassed by the necessity, but was not pretending the necessity did not exist. He looked at her. He thought about the woman who had read the terms of his entailment overnight before their first formal meeting, the woman who had managed tenant farms in secret for 4 years, the woman who had negotiated across a table with a duke and come away with everything she had asked for, the woman who had gone through 20 years of estate records alone by candlelight and found the one document that changed everything. He picked up the nearest page. He read it. Then he turned to the next page and read that. He set it down. He said, "My parliamentary contact, the man on the Reform Committee, has been trying to get a property law amendment bill through 3 sessions without sufficient parliamentary support. The committee needs testimony from someone who can speak to the practical effects of current entailment law on real estates with real consequences, not theoretical argument, specific, documented, practical cases." He looked at her. He has been looking for a credible voice. She was very still. "You do not need the pseudonym," he said. "You need to be introduced to Broughton. Your actual name, which is now a name that carries considerable weight in the relevant rooms. Behind this work is worth more than any fiction." She stared at him. He understood, looking at her face, that he had just handed her the thing she had been trying to obtain by other means. The thing she had been writing toward for 2 years. The thing she had been quietly, persistently, precisely working in the direction of since before she had known such a direction was available to her. She stood up. She crossed the room to him in 3 steps. She kissed him. It was the first time she had initiated. He recognized this. He had been aware, with precise attention, of the choreography of their physical closeness, the gradual reduction of the careful distance they had maintained in the first weeks, the occasional moments of deliberate contact, but she had never until now been the one to choose the beginning of it. He brought his hands up to cup her face. not to hold her in place, just to hold her, because she was there and choosing to be there, and that was not a small thing. He kissed her back without the possessiveness that had characterized the earlier versions of their physical history, without the performance of command. He kissed her the way he had learned, over 3 months, to be with her, without management, without strategy, with the particular honesty of a person who has finally found a space in which honesty is not a tactical liability. She pulled back after a moment. She looked at him. She said, "I would like to meet Broughton." "Tomorrow," he said. She turned back to her desk. She picked up her pen. She began to revise the title page, the pseudonym crossed out, a real name written in its place. He sat in the chair across from her. He picked up a book from the nearest shelf. He read it. She wrote. The fire was steady. The east wing was warm. Outside the Ravenswood windows, the Yorkshire dales were beginning their slow greening towards spring. The moor grass coming back from winter with the particular stubborn life of things that survive because they were built for surviving rather than merely for looking well. Later, not that night, but 3 weeks later, in the way that important understandings rarely arrive as single moments, but as the accumulated recognition of many small moments, Vivienne sat at the East Wing desk and thought about ruin, about the word itself and what it had been designed to do. She thought about the morning she had stood at her father's window and heard 2 women laughing, and how the world that existed before that morning, the world of the careful performance, the beige cashmere, the suppressed edges, and the managed competence and the continuous effort of being small enough to be acceptable. That world had not actually been a safe world. It had looked like a safe world from the inside. It was actually a world entirely dependent on the continued cooperation of people who had no real interest in her safety, maintained only by her willingness to be useful to them, in the specific circumscribed way they found acceptable. The moment she stopped being useful in that way, the moment she became inconvenient, the safety evaporated, because it had never been safety. It had been conditional tolerance. She thought about the word ruin and how it had been used as a weapon, handed to her like a sentence, like a verdict, like the final determination of a court she had never been invited to attend. She thought about what had actually been ruined, not her. She was not ruined. She was 3 months into a life that was more genuinely hers, more fully occupied by her actual capacities, her actual interests, her actual affections, than anything that had preceded it. What had actually been ruined was the performance. The long, exhausting, carefully maintained performance of a woman who asked permission before using her own intelligence, who suppressed her own observations in deference to the comfortable fictions of men who found accuracy inconvenient, who had been so good for so long that she had nearly forgotten she was performing. That had been ruined, she thought. Good. She thought about her husband, who was downstairs in the main library, reviewing parliamentary notes with the particular absorbed concentration brought to intellectual problems he had decided were worth his attention, who had stood in a mews-yard in the cold and told her 12 names he had not told anyone, who had sat in this room and told her 35 more when she asked, who had read 2 pages of her work and handed her the door she had been looking for without requiring her to explain why she needed it. She thought about the word chosen. She had told Cedric in the pump room that she would choose Adrian again without any of the conditions that had produced the original choice. She had said this because it was true, because it was important that Cedric understand it, because she had wanted to say it in a room that had once witnessed the best version of Cedric's performance and let the contrasts sit in the air where they could both feel it. But she had not said it to Adrian. She would say it to him. Not tonight, because tonight she had a treatise to finish and had parliamentary notes to review, and the rhythm of their shared evenings was one of the things she had come to love without quite deciding to. The parallel work, the occasional exchange, the comfortable silence of two people whose minds were both fully occupied and not in competition with each other's fullness. She would say it to him. There was no urgency. He was going to be in this house tomorrow, and the day after, and the Yorkshire Road would keep. She looked at the title page. Her name, written in her own hand on work that was hers. She thought, this is what the other side of ruin looks like. She picked up her pen. She wrote. And that is where we leave Vivienne Ashford, now Vivienne Blackwell, Duchess of Ravenswood, not at the end of a story, but at the beginning of the one she actually chose. Not the story that was handed to her. Not the story that was written for her by two women laughing on a pavement, or by a two-sentence note from a man who thought she was manageable, or by the social machinery of a world that had decided her value lay in her compliance, her own story. There is something worth holding from this account that goes beyond the romance of it. Though the romance is real, and it earned itself, and it deserves the full weight of what it means, when two people who were both made smaller by their histories find that together they are larger than they were alone. Here is the thing worth holding. Vivienne's ruin was constructed from the outside and landed with such force precisely because she had made herself available to it. Not through weakness, she was never weak, but through the long, daily practice of performing smallness for a world that required it. When we suppress our capabilities to fit into spaces that were not designed for our full dimensions, we do not become safer. We become legible to people who want to use the gap between who we are and who we are pretending to be. The world will call many things ruinous that are actually simply honest. The question is not whether you survive the ruin. The question is what you build on the cleared ground. And Adrian, this man who had been a weapon for so long that he had stopped believing he was anything else, carries his own lesson. The 47 men he carried were not his to carry alone. They were never meant to be. Grief that is never witnessed becomes a kind of prison, and the only key is the willingness to let someone else into the counting of it, not to take it from you, just to share the number. If someone in your life is carrying a number, let them tell you what it is. Say it back to them. That is what love looks like when it has not yet learned it is love. Thank you, not as a formality. Genuinely, because you just gave 2 hours to a woman who only exists on a page, and that means something real. Vivienne spent 23 years performing smallness for a world that did not deserve the effort. And then she stopped, and everything that was supposed to destroy her became the thing that built her. If any part of that felt familiar, if you have ever suppressed something true about yourself to fit into a space that was not built for your full dimensions, leave us a comment. Tell us which moment in this story hit differently. Tell us which line you had to stop and sit with. And tell us where in the world you are watching from. We want to put a pin in every city, every country, every corner this story reaches. One word is enough. We will say hello. If you are not yet subscribed, this is the moment, not because we are asking a favor, but because there are more women like Vivienne waiting in the stories ahead. And a subscription is how you make sure you are there when they arrive. Like this video, if Vivienne earned it, she did. We will see you in the next story.